The smell hit Saburo Sakai before the logic did. Burned cordite and something sweeter underneath it, like warm rubber drifting back through the open cockpit of a Zero somewhere over Guadalcanal in August of 1942. He had just put a full second of cannon fire into the belly of an American Wildcat, watched the tracers walk straight through the fuselage just aft of the engine, seen the aluminum skin dimple and tear the way aluminum skin tears when something traveling at 2,800 feet per second passes through it. The Wildcat shuddered. It did not burn, it did not spiral. It rolled left, dropped 400 feet, and then, and this is the part Sakai would describe in his memoir 3 decades later, with something close to genuine bewilderment, it leveled out and climbed back into the fight. The fuel tank on that aircraft had been punctured by at least 3 rounds. Sakai knew this because he had aimed for it specifically. He had been taught that the fuel tank was the kill shot, the guaranteed end of the engagement, and the American airplane simply kept flying. What he did not know, what none of the Japanese pilots had been told, was that the tank itself had already been taught to survive. The tank that wanted to kill its own pilot. Here is a number that clarifies everything about early aviation fuel system design. 0. As in, 0 meaningful effort was invested across most of the 1920s in protecting the fuel tanks of military aircraft from combat damage. Not because engineers were careless, because the problem was considered, in the words of one Army Air Corps procurement memo from 1929, secondary to performance parameters. Think about what that means. The men writing those memos understood that fuel tanks could be hit. They understood that aviation fuel ignites at roughly 240 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature easily exceeded by tracer rounds, which burn at over 1,800 degrees. They understood that a ruptured tank spraying fuel over a hot engine or a burning tracer is, in practical terms, a flying bomb. They understood all of this, and they decided that it was less important than keeping the aircraft light enough to go fast. This was not stupidity. It was a reasonable bet made in a specific historical context. In the 1920s, aerial combat was still largely theoretical for most military planners. The Great War had ended. Nobody expected another one soon. And in peacetime procurement, performance sells, speed sells, ceiling sells. Survivability is an abstraction until the moment it isn't. The consequence of this calculus was a generation of military aircraft flying into the 1930s with fuel tanks that were, in essence, thin aluminium boxes filled with highly flammable liquid. Hit the box, the liquid escapes. The liquid meets ignition. The pilot dies. Meet Major James Jimmy Doolittle, 36 years old in 1932, born in Alameda, California. Before his famous raid on Tokyo, before all of that, Doolittle spent years as a racing pilot and aeronautical engineer, and he understood aircraft fuel systems better than almost any other military officer in the United States. He was one of the first to articulate the problem in language that procurement officers could not easily dismiss. In a series of technical papers and internal Army Air Corps memos in the early 1930s, Doolittle argued that aircraft survivability was not a secondary concern. It was a force multiplier. A plane that could absorb punishment and keep flying was worth more, tactically, than a faster plane that burned on the first fuel tank hit. Nobody listened immediately. They rarely do. But the problem kept generating data. Exercises in the 1930s produced after-action reports showing that simulated fuel tank hits resulted in catastrophic loss rates. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939 produced real data. German and Soviet pilots returning with combat reports describing fuel fires as the primary cause of aerial losses. The numbers from Spain were specific enough to be alarming. Roughly 60% of aircraft losses in the conflict were attributable to fire, and the majority of those fires originated in the fuel system. 60%. Hold that number. The British were paying attention. The Royal Air Force began working on armoured fuel tanks in the late 1930s, and by the Battle of Britain in 1940, RAF Hurricanes and Spitfires were equipped with tanks that had some degree of self-sealing capability. The technology was imperfect. The early British self-sealing tanks used a layered rubber construction that added weight and reduced fuel capacity, but they worked well enough to matter. The Americans were watching all of this, and in Dayton, Ohio, at Wright Field, the Army Air Corps' primary research and development facility, a small team of engineers was about to take the British concept and do something the British hadn't quite managed. They were going to make it work properly. The core insight was not complicated. It was almost embarrassingly simple once someone stated it clearly. A fuel tank hit by a bullet creates a hole. The hole allows fuel to escape. If the material surrounding the hole could be made to swell and close that hole faster than the fuel escapes, specifically faster than the fuel can reach an ignition source, the tank would, in practical terms, be self-repairing. The question was what material could do that? Natural rubber swells when exposed to petroleum products. This was known. The problem was that natural rubber also degrades, adds significant weight, and in the layered configurations the British were using, could separate from the metal tank wall under combat stress. The Wright Field team, working under the umbrella of what the Army Air Corps called the Materiel Division, began experimenting with synthetic rubber compounds in the late 1930s. Specifically, they were looking at neoprene, a synthetic rubber developed by DuPont in 1931. Neoprene had properties that natural rubber lacked. It was more resistant to petroleum degradation, it bonded more reliably to metal surfaces, and, critically, it swelled aggressively when exposed to aviation fuel, exactly the behavior you want when a bullet punches through a tank wall. The configuration the Wright Field team settled on was a laminated construction, an inner layer of neoprene bonded to the aluminum tank wall, an outer layer of a slightly different rubber compound chosen for its structural properties. Between them, a layer of vulcanized rubber that would absorb the mechanical shock of a bullet impact. When a round punched through this sandwich, the neoprene inner layer, now exposed to the leaking fuel, would swell. The swelling would close the hole. The closing would happen in seconds, not minutes, seconds. By 1940, the first production-quality American self-sealing fuel tanks were ready for testing. The results were striking enough that the Army Air Corps moved immediately to mandate them across new fighter designs. Stop and think about what this means for the timeline. The F-4F Wildcat, the plane that Zero pilots were shooting at over the Solomons in 1942 and 1943, entered production with self-sealing tanks. The P-40 Warhawk, which American and British Commonwealth pilots were flying over North Africa, had self-sealing tanks. The P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the F-6F Hellcat, all of them self-sealing tanks as a baseline specification. The Japanese were not standing still. They had their own aviation engineers, their own research programs, but they made a different set of choices. And those choices would cost them in ways they were not prepared to understand. The philosophy of the empty wing. The Zero, the Mitsubishi A6M, formerly the Type 0 carrier fighter, was, by any reasonable assessment, a masterpiece of 1940s aeronautical engineering. When it appeared over China in 1940, it was the best carrier-based fighter in the world. Possibly the best fighter in the world, full stop. Its range was extraordinary, over 1,600 miles on internal fuel with a drop tank, at a time when the F-4F Wildcat could barely manage 830 miles. Its maneuverability was extraordinary, a turning radius that most Allied fighters simply could not match. Its rate of climb was extraordinary. Its armament, two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, was heavier than anything the Americans were flying in 1941. How did Mitsubishi's chief designer, Jiro Horikoshi, achieve all of this? By making the Zero weigh almost nothing. The A6M2 Model 21, the version that attacks Pearl Harbor, weighed 5,313 pounds empty. The F-4F Wildcat weighed 5,895 pounds empty. That is a 582-pound difference. In aviation, 582 pounds is the difference between a sports car and a sedan. It changes everything about how the aircraft handles. Horikoshi achieved this weight through a philosophy of ruthless elimination. Every component was analyzed for weight. Every gram that could be removed was removed. And the components that were eliminated or reduced to the absolute minimum included structural protection for the pilot and structural protection for the fuel system. The Zero had no pilot armor. None. The seat back was aluminium. The windscreen was standard plexiglass, not armored glass. There was no armor plate behind the pilot's head, no armor plate under the seat, and the fuel tanks were unprotected, not self-sealing, not armored. Thin aluminium walls filled with aviation fuel surrounded by the airframe. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate engineering choice, made explicitly and documented in Horikoshi's own design records. The weight penalty of self-sealing tanks was considered unacceptable. The weight penalty of pilot armor was considered unacceptable. The Zero was designed to win by not being hit, by outmaneuvering, outclimbing, and outranging any opponent before that opponent could get into a firing position. It was a coherent philosophy. It was also a philosophy that depended entirely on the assumption that the enemy would never develop tactics specifically designed to defeat it. Meet Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, 35 years old in 1941, born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, a Naval Academy graduate who had been flying Navy fighters since 1930. When the Zero's performance data reached American intelligence, pieced together from reports out of China and after Pearl Harbor from captured documents, Thatch read the numbers and understood immediately that the Wildcat could not outturn, outclimb, or outrun the Zero in a conventional dogfight. His response was to stop trying. Working with his squadron, VF-3, flying from the carrier Saratoga, Thatch developed what became known as the beam defense position, or, as everyone called it, the Thatch weave. Two fighters flying parallel to each other, when one is attacked, both turn toward each other. The attacker, following the first aircraft, now finds himself in the gun sights of the second. The maneuver required teamwork, communication, and discipline. It required American pilots to resist the instinct to break away and run. And it required something else. It required that the American aircraft be able to absorb hits and keep flying long enough for the weave to work. Here is the key detail that most histories of the Thatch weave skip over. The weave only works if the aircraft being attacked doesn't immediately burst into flames when the Zero gets a firing solution. If the first burst of 20mm cannon fire turns the Wildcat into a fireball, there is no time for the second Wildcat to complete its turn. The weave is not just a tactical maneuver. It is a tactical maneuver that depends on the physical survivability of the aircraft executing it. The self-sealing tank is not a footnote to the Thatch weave. It is a prerequisite. Thatch demonstrated the weave in combat for the first time at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. His division of 4 Wildcats engaged a group of 15 to 20 Zeros. They used the weave. They survived. 3 of his 4 pilots made it back to the carrier. 1 Zero was confirmed destroyed, several more probably destroyed. The numbers are not the point. The point is that 4 aircraft in an obsolescent fighter engaged 15 to 20 of the best fighters in the world, and most of them came home. That was not supposed to be possible. The Japanese pilots who engaged Thatcher's division filed their own reports. Several described hitting American fighters, seeing impacts, and watching the planes continue flying. The reports described this as puzzling. They used language that, in translation, comes across as almost offended. These planes should not be flying. They were right. By the physics of aluminium and aviation fuel, those planes should not have been flying. But the physics had been changed. The neoprene had done its job. Now consider what was happening on the Japanese side of the same engagements. Zero pilots had no self-sealing tanks, a single .5 caliber round, the M2 Browning machine gun, standard armament on American fighters, firing at 2,810 feet per second, punching through a Zero's wing tank, created a hole that would not close. The fuel would flow. If the round was a tracer, or if the fuel contacted a hot engine component, the result was fire. Immediate, catastrophic, unsurvivable fire. This asymmetry, American tanks sealing, Japanese tanks burning, produced a pattern in combat loss data that should have been obvious to Japanese intelligence analysts by mid-1942. American fighters were surviving fuel tank hits at a rate that defied the known physics of unprotected aluminium tanks. Japanese fighters were dying from fuel tank hits at the rate you would expect from unprotected aluminium tanks. The data was there. The conclusion was available. It took them far too long to draw it. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of how a technology most people have never heard of quietly changed the outcome of the Pacific Air War, not the version that survived in headlines about Midway and Guadalcanal, but the version recorded in engineering memos and combat reports that nobody thought to read together, press the like button. It keeps this kind of forensic history visible a little longer, and that matters. Часть третья. The Solomons, the data, and the silence. By August 1942, the United States Marines had landed on Guadalcanal. The airfield they captured, Henderson Field, became the center of one of the most sustained aerial campaigns of the Pacific War. For 6 months, Japanese and American air power ground against each other over the same patch of jungle and coral. The air battles over Guadalcanal generated more combat data more quickly than almost any other theater of the war. American pilots landed at Henderson Field, got debriefed, and their reports were collated by intelligence officers who were specifically looking for patterns. Japanese pilots flew back to Rabaul or to their carriers, got debriefed, and their reports went up a chain of command that was less systematically analytical. Here is what the American data showed by the end of 1942. The F-4F Wildcat's fuel system was sustaining hits, documented, confirmed hits, with physical evidence on recovered aircraft and continuing to function. The Wright Field records from this period document specific cases: aircraft returning to Henderson Field with bullet holes in the fuel tank area, fuel staining around the entry wounds, and tanks that had sealed and held. In one documented case from November 1942, a Wildcat from VMF 121, Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 121, returned with 2 entry wounds in the port wing tank, consistent with 7.7mm rounds. The tank had sealed. The pilot, Second Lieutenant Jefferson DeBlanc, 22 years old, from Lockport, Louisiana, a former student at Southwestern Louisiana Institute who had enlisted in the Marines in 1941, landed without incident and did not know his tank had been hit until the ground crew found the holes during inspection. DeBlanc went on to become one of the highest-scoring Marine aces of the Pacific War, ultimately credited with 9 aerial victories and awarded the Medal of Honor. He was alive to fly those missions partly because of the neoprene in his wing tanks. The Japanese data from the same period told a different story. Zero pilots returning from Guadalcanal missions described American fighters absorbing hits that should have been fatal. The reports were consistent. They were also, within the Japanese command structure, treated as a secondary concern. The primary analytical focus of Japanese air intelligence in the Guadalcanal period was on American tactics, specifically on the coordination between fighters and ground control radar, which the Japanese correctly identified as a significant American advantage. The fuel tank anomaly was noted. It was not investigated. This is the critical failure, not a tactical failure, not a strategic failure, an analytical failure. The Japanese had the data. They had pilots describing the same phenomenon, American planes not burning after fuel tank hits, across dozens of missions over 6 months. A systematic analysis of those reports would have led, fairly quickly, to the hypothesis that American aircraft were equipped with some form of fuel tank protection. That hypothesis would have led to examination of captured American aircraft. Examination of captured American aircraft would have revealed the self-sealing tank construction. That revelation would have led to the obvious question: why don't we have this? None of that happened. Or rather, it happened far too slowly, and the conclusions it generated were not acted on with the urgency the situation demanded. Part of the explanation is institutional. The Imperial Japanese Navy's aviation intelligence apparatus was not structured for the kind of cross-referencing that would have connected the dots. Combat reports from individual pilots went to squadron intelligence officers, who summarized them for wing commanders, who passed summaries upward. By the time information reached the level where decisions about aircraft design could be made, the Naval Air Technical Arsenal at Yokosuka, it had been filtered through several layers of summarization, each of which tended to strip out the kind of specific anomalous detail that would have flagged the fuel tank problem. Part of the explanation is cultural. The Zero's design philosophy, the philosophy that had produced the most capable carrier fighter in the world, was deeply embedded in the Naval Air Technical Arsenal. The engineers who had built the Zero believed in the philosophy of the empty wing. Challenging that philosophy meant challenging not just a design choice, but an institutional identity. And part of the explanation is simply the speed of events. The Guadalcanal campaign was consuming Japanese air power at a rate that left little time for the kind of systematic analysis that might have identified the fuel tank problem and generated a response. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 800 aircraft in the Solomons Theatre. 800 aircraft. The pilots who could have provided the most detailed first-hand observations of American aircraft survivability were dying faster than they could be replaced. 800 aircraft. Read that again. The fuel tank problem was one thread in a much larger unravelling, but it was a thread that, pulled at the right moment, might have led somewhere important. Early in 1943, the Japanese did begin examining captured American aircraft more systematically. A Grumman F-4F Wildcat that had been forced down relatively intact on a Japanese-held island in the Solomons was transported to the Naval Air Technical Arsenal at Yokosuka. Engineers there examined the fuel system in detail. They found the self-sealing construction, they documented it, they understood it. The engineering report that resulted from this examination is a remarkable document. It describes the neoprene laminate construction accurately. It correctly identifies the mechanism, fuel contact causing swelling, swelling closing the hole. It notes, with what reads in translation as something close to professional admiration, that the construction adds relatively little weight for the protection it provides. The report recommends development of a Japanese equivalent. The recommendation went up the chain, it was approved, development began. And then, time ran out. Часть четвертая. The forensic verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The Japanese aviation industry did not lack the knowledge to build self-sealing fuel tanks. By early 1943, they had examined American tanks, understood the construction, and begun development of their own version. The engineering capability existed. The materials, synthetic rubber compounds comparable to neoprene, were available in Japan, though in more limited quantities, existed. The institutional will, once the problem was properly understood, existed. What they lacked was time. And the reason they lacked time was that they spent roughly 18 months failing to systematically analyze combat data that was pointing directly at the problem. The American program that produced the self-sealing tank was not a secret. The tanks were on every American fighter in the Pacific from the beginning of the war. Every Zero pilot who shot at a Wildcat and watched it keep flying was, in a sense, receiving a technical briefing on American fuel system technology. The data collection was happening automatically, in real time, across hundreds of engagements. The failure was not collection. The failure was analysis. Consider the specific timeline. The Zero enters combat over China in 1940. American intelligence begins receiving reports of its performance by late 1940, early 1941. Those reports are analyzed, synthesized, and used to develop tactical responses, including the Thatch-Weave before Pearl Harbor. The Americans are doing this analysis in months. The Japanese receive comparable data about American aircraft survivability starting in the first weeks of the Pacific War, December 1941. they are still examining captured wildcats to understand the fuel tank construction in early 1943. That is over a year of combat data generating the same observation: American planes not burning after tank hits before the mechanism is systematically investigated. Why the asymmetry in analytical speed? Several factors, and none of them flattering to the Japanese institutional structure. The United States Navy and Army Air Forces had, by late 1941, developed a reasonably functional intelligence-to-engineering feedback loop. Combat reports were being read by people who had the technical background to identify anomalies and the institutional access to route those anomalies to the relevant engineers. The system was imperfect. American intelligence had its own failures, some of them catastrophic, but it was designed to move information from the front to the lab with some degree of speed. The Japanese system was more hierarchical and less analytically sophisticated at the operational level. Intelligence officers at the squadron and wing level were primarily focused on tactical information, enemy positions, formations, radio frequencies. Technical anomalies in enemy aircraft performance were not their primary concern, and the system did not have a clear pathway for routing such observations to the engineers who could act on them. There is also the matter of the Zero's success. The Zero's dominance in the first months of the Pacific War, its absolute superiority over every Allied fighter it encountered in the first 6 months, created an institutional confidence that made it harder to hear bad news. When your fighter is winning, reports of enemy aircraft surviving hits read more easily as pilot error or exaggeration than as evidence of a fundamental technological gap. This is not a Japanese failure, this is a human failure. The same dynamic, success breeding analytical complacency, appears in American, British, German, and Soviet aviation history. It is a pattern, not an aberration. But in this specific case, the pattern had specific consequences. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat entered service in August 1943. It was faster than the Zero. It climbed faster than the Zero. It could dive faster than the Zero. It had pilot armor. It had an armored windscreen. It had self-sealing fuel tanks with a capacity of 250 gallons, protected by neoprene laminate construction that was, by this point, 2 generations more refined than what had been on the Wildcat in 1941. The Hellcat's combat debut at Marcus Island in August 1943 produced kill ratios that the Japanese command found difficult to believe. Over the course of the war, Hellcats were credited with 5,163 aerial victories, against 320 Hellcats lost in air-to-air combat, a ratio of roughly 16:1. The self-sealing tank is not the only reason for that ratio. The Hellcat was a better aircraft across nearly every performance parameter. American pilot training had improved dramatically, American tactics had evolved, American radar and ground control had become sophisticated. All of these factors contributed. But the self-sealing tank is part of the reason. Every Hellcat that survived a fuel tank hit and kept fighting, every pilot who landed back on his carrier with holes in his wings and went up the next day, represents a compounding of American air power that the Japanese, with their unprotected tanks, could not match. The Japanese did eventually introduce self-sealing tanks on later Zero variants and on the aircraft that followed the Zero. The A6M5 Model 52, introduced in mid-1943, had a marginally improved fuel system. Later variants had proper self-sealing tanks, but the weight penalty that Horikoshi had been so determined to avoid was real. The self-sealing tanks added weight that the Zero's engine could not fully compensate for, and the later, heavier Zeros were slower and less maneuverable than the originals. The choice made in the design room, weight over survivability, had consequences that could not be fully reversed once the design was in production. Meet the Zero one more time, not as a masterpiece, as a document. The Zero is a document of what happens when a design philosophy that was correct in one context, the context of 1938 when the Zero was being designed, when no Allied fighter could match it, when the war it was being built to fight had not yet been imagined in its full shape, meets a context that has changed in ways the designers could not predict. Horikoshi was not wrong to prioritize weight in 1938. He was making the best possible aircraft for the war he expected to fight. The war he got was different. The Wildcat had self-sealing tanks. The Hellcat had self-sealing tanks. The F-4U Corsair had self-sealing tanks. The P-38 had self-sealing tanks. Every American fighter the Zero encountered after December 1941 had been designed with the lesson that Spain and the Battle of Britain had provided. 60% of aircraft losses come from fire, and fire comes from the fuel system, and the fuel system can be protected. Japan had access to the same lesson. The Spanish Civil War data was available. The Battle of Britain data was available. The choice not to incorporate self-sealing tanks was made with eyes open, not in ignorance. That choice made the Zero faster and more maneuverable in 1941. It made the Zero a death trap in 1943. Now go back to the Solomon Islands, 1943. A Zero pilot fires into the wing root of a Wildcat. He watches the rounds go in. He sees the impact. The Wildcat rolls away and keeps flying. He does not know about the neoprene. He does not know about the Wright Field engineers who spent 3 years working out the laminate construction. He does not know that the hole his bullet made is already closing, the synthetic rubber swelling against the fuel pressure, the fuel held back from the hot engine components that would have turned it into fire. He knows only that the plane should be burning, and it isn't. He files a report. His intelligence officer reads it, makes a note, moves on. Somewhere in Dayton, Ohio, nobody is paying attention to any of this because nobody needs to. The problem has been solved. The solution is in the air. And the Zero pilot, banking away over the blue water of the slot, is flying an aircraft whose designers made a different choice, a brilliant choice, a choice that made the Zero the finest carrier fighter of its generation, and is now paying the price for that choice in a currency his designers never intended. The Wildcat is still flying. That is the whole story. If this investigation gave you something, a clearer picture of how a quiet engineering decision in Dayton changed the arithmetic of the Pacific Air War, press like. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember this, the most decisive weapons in history are often the ones nobody writes songs about, the ones that just quietly do their job while the bullets go in and the plane keeps flying. The neoprene held.